Welcome to the Tenet Podcast, the podcast whose mission is to promote artists and the visual arts. Each week, we bring you a profile of an artist, gallery, museum, or something pertaining to the art world. If this is your first time, we hope that you enjoy it, and we'll take the time to explore the Tenet archives. And if you are one of our regular listeners, Wes and I would like to take this moment to say thank you for listening and your continued support. If you do like the podcast, one way you can show your support and our mission is to take a moment and subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. And as always, please feel free to share Tenet on social media and with your community. So without further ado, Tenet is honored and would like to welcome Dean Sobel, director of the Clyfford Still Museum located in Denver, Colorado, to the program. Dean, how are you this evening?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
We are so happy and honored to have you. We're so excited to talk about Mr. Still's work. But before we delve into the museum and his work, we're curious about how you came to become the director of the museum.
Well, I'm an art museum guy. I, had a sort of long career over 3 institutions. And the Still Project was something that was fairly well known in museum and art history circles. The fact that Still had left this big body of work, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that later, or I hope we do. But it was a known sort of entity. And by this point in my career, and this was 15 years ago in 2004 into 2005, the idea of specializing, and particularly this the unique nature of this project was really, really interesting for me. So I really came up through art museums.
And so you started off in Milwaukee, is that true?
Yes, quite literally. I got my foot in the door as an intern and then stayed for 13 years. So that was a general museum. It collected mostly what we would call the Western Hemisphere, and particularly strong in 19th and 20th century art, especially 20th century art, but it was more or less a general museum.
Did you get a degree in like art museum curating or?
Art history, actually. I mean, there are some, like arts management, or even quite common now are museum studies certificates or concentrations, normally paired with art history, also anthropology if you're going into science and history museums. But it was from a straight art history background, which is not so unusual. Particularly, I was interested in the curatorial track because there's a lot of jobs at museums that don't involve that deeper knowledge. But I was very interested in seeing if I could figure out a way to work in a museum, and it worked. Turned out well.
So, as an art historian, was there a particular period you kind of focused on or specialized in?
Well, it's interesting. In graduate school, I was a modernist, and my thesis was in European art between the wars. But when I started in Milwaukee, that museum had a fantastic collection of art from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, namely because it was what they could afford to acquire. Like a lot of museums, if you weren't given the Rembrandts in the 1920s or the Impressionists in the 30s and 40s, you were kind of left out of luck. You couldn't go buy those things. But Milwaukee had some very talented curators that were buying the art of their time. So again, particularly the 60s and 70s. And so I got very involved in contemporary art, the art of our time, if you will, in Milwaukee, and my next post too in Aspen. So I'm really a 20th century guy, the century where Still sits comfortably.
And you were in Aspen, Colorado?
For 5 years, which is a non-collecting museum. Not uncommon, especially in Europe. There's a fair number of them in, all over the world. But it was a very different, you usually refer to them in the German sense, Kunsthalles, which are very common. In Europe, they're often, and particularly Germany, they're government funded in many respects, or they were. Every region had a Kunsthalle where contemporary art exhibitions were brought in or originated. And Aspen had a very interested audience in very recent art, usually second homeowners or people that were beginning to stay, year round. And it was wonderful and very challenging to try to sort of match the wits of people who were equally as passionate and were as up to the minute as anybody.
And you were there for 5 years at the Aspen
Yes.
Art Museum? I was reading an article today that was written by Stuart
Oxenhorn. Yes.
Yeah. And it was a really nice article. Like, I could just tell that he just thought the world of you, and the way that you presented, your thoughtfulness and curating there at the museum, and then just how you related to people and how you shared your passion of the art with them, people that didn't necessarily know anything about art.
Yeah, and contemporary art, or certainly 20th century art, can be challenging for people, even work that's 125 years old now. So if you can't connect the art or what you're doing with people, you're doing something wrong. I mean, you really must do that in terms of our missions at art museums. But in Aspen, it was, Aspen is a city like no other. Stuart wrote for one of 2 papers that had art critics, probably 2 or 3 magazines that were based there. It was just this incredible art town. I mean, it was really a lot of fun to work there.
So you resigned your position there before you pursued
Correct.
the position to working. Actually, you started working with the city at first, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a kind of, it's not that complicated, but the will of Clyfford Still specified that all of this art, that again we'll get to talking about, would be given to an American city. So it had to go to a city. And so after a lot of failed attempts around the country, and it had to be American, which was not an insignificant part of the condition as well, the city had to be involved from the very beginning. And there's a much longer version of that story. It covered 2 different mayors, Mayor Webb, and then ultimately Mayor Hickenlooper. But it was, and the collection still is owned by the city, that we have it on permanent unrestricted use at the museum, but we technically and legally don't own it. And it's just a function of the city requirement that was in Still's will. And there's very good agreements that sort of, tie all these things together. But indeed, I was in the city office building for the first year. There was no offices. It was a very, very nascent project. There was a lot to get done. There was no way to pay me. I always loved telling that story. When I started, there was no bank account. And there are a few things you need to open a bank if you're just a man off the street. Hey, I got a new museum and some checks. But long story short, I was probably in the Webb office building for about 5 years. Enjoyably. It was actually really fun living in that microcosm of Denver.
Yeah.
So you oversaw a lot of things early on before this, even became a museum. You were very much part of that vision. Is that correct?
Yes, a board was formed within the first year. And then with a small number of staff members, when I started, there was a part-time individual. Shout out to Chase DeForest, the only person who had been working there before me. The 2 of us did it for 3 or 4 years. So it was a very small project. So I oversaw everything. I mean, literally, from getting a bank account with Chase, not the bank, but my colleague, and everything moving forward from that point.
Obviously, there was other cities that approached or tried to get the loan or the lease or whatever.
The gift, yeah.
Yeah, the gift. Where did they fail where Denver really excelled to get it?
Yes, and that's, that can be a very, very long story. But the basics of it, just for the listeners, is when Still died, his will revealed, it was a very simple will. It's a single legal size sheet of paper type. They typed it. That said, all this art would be given to an American city. He gave his then wife, Patricia Still, the decision-making power to choose that city. But for a variety of reasons and under a number of conditions, I think, Mrs. Still didn't really do much. She waited for the phone to ring, waited for suitors to come and make a pitch, if you will, or discuss it with her. And so it took, Denver got involved, Still died in 1980, probably by 83, 84, 85, the estate had been settled and she was probably able to start really working on this. But the museum didn't open until 2011. Denver came in 2004. So it took 24 years to get a deal struck. And I think there was a lot of concern in all parties, interested and uninterested, as to what was going to happen to this. I guess to answer your main question, I think a number of previous museums or foundations did realize that it had to go to a city. You needed to bring a city cultural affairs person, maybe a mayor or someone, a developer who might be close to the city structure, but it really did require a governmental agency to complete it. And I think in some cases there was initial interest, like it got very far in Atlanta, but then, because of probably not nearly as bad as what we're going through now with COVID, but, there's always things that set you back. A term limited mayor steps out, or who knows what all the situations. But I think more commonly, from what I've begun to understand, is I think a lot of people approached Mrs. Still and said, we don't want all, 3,500 artworks, 800 paintings, most of them big. Could we take 100 of the best ones and leave you to find somewhere else to do it? Or possibly, could we sell one of the best ones and fund the whole thing? And that was not what Mrs. Still wanted. And, she had to sort through all of that along the way too. People who were really committed to doing it.
His will and testament, that was a one-page legal document, but it sounds like, especially from the documentary Lifeline that Wes and I both have watched, that Mrs. Still kind of had a vision herself of what she wanted this to be as well, especially knowing her husband.
Yes.
And his thought process, that she had some ideas of what this should be.
Yeah, and that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, she had a lot of time. Denver actually made a run for it in the Webb administration in the late 90s, brought the Denver Art Museum along, and they realized that was not the player to bring. And so when they did it again under Hickenlooper, they realized to leave those people at home, even though the Art Museum was very helpful and involved in a number of important ways. But it really, Mrs. Still added things to what became the final agreement, which weren't always enforceable. A lot of them were just good ideas we would have done anyways. Some were antiquated, certain design things, that there were better technologies and so forth. And then the artist's children became involved from his first marriage. And they were the representatives of the state for most of the time I was involved with the project. So they were able to let us not do certain things for very good reasons. And so Mrs. Still had a vision, but it wasn't that restrictive to what we were going to, what we wanted to do anyways. And, there were other restrictions that were in the will that were, that she was in charge of enforcing as well, but there weren't a lot of things. But then it became a little bit more nuanced when she started adding in some other suggestions.
This seems like this is probably very unusual for an artist to go, this is how I want this ran. I wanted the city to buy it, build a museum, and keep all my stuff in it. That's got to be unusual, right?
Yes.
And that you can't sell it. You can't.
Yeah, the city didn't buy it either. It was given. What we think is probably billions of dollars of art if you were to ever try to go to that level. So it was a very generous gift, but you had to build the museum, which was not an easy thing to do. But yes, it's very unusual, and probably more typical, in fact, certainly more typical, is an artist will put his or her work into an estate with specific purposes or foundations. And that might be to further the research and understanding of this body of work. It might be to fund artist fellowships or exhibitions of other contemporaries and so forth. But Still's very specific directive is quite uncommon. Or even if it goes to an estate and heirs are in charge, it very typically will get placed in the hands of dealers, art dealers, gallerists, they like to be called. And in that respect, the work gets dispersed very widely. So, if you didn't sell a lot of it during your lifetime, and usually very valuable estates, there probably was a lot of activity during the lifetime. But usually the directive is to slowly and carefully and methodically distribute it over time, retaining maybe certain key pictures or not. But that's quite different than Still's decision, in fact, very early in his career, to do everything he could to keep it together. So it's exactly the opposite of what most artists do, is to get it out there in the world.
He felt very strongly about his work. And in fact, he was almost very, what's the word I want to use?
The polite word you want to use?
Very protective of his work.
Yeah,
like
absolutely
almost,
true.
Almost like his, I don't want to say biggest fan, but he knew he had a vision. He had this integrity that you don't see in a lot of other artists. And it was always about the work and the art. And he was very specific on how he dealt with the art world and galleries and art critics and all that.
Yeah, I think he felt, in fact, I know he did, that, his art or any art in the wrong hands gets ruined, exploited, ruined in physical ways. And so, yes, he was very, very protective of not only his art, but I think he was very protective of art and the ideas that surround art and the people that make art. He just felt passionately about other aspects of it as well.
So at this point, I think I want to set the stage, because some of our listeners are, they're not necessarily art collectors or artists. They're people that just enjoy the story. And this is a great story. Explain what art movement Mr. Clyfford Still comes from, or what he was a part of.
Yeah, I think that is probably a good idea if we say something about why we're even talking about him at all. But yeah, it's probably this very unique moment that only happens, twice a century probably. But it was a number of figures on both coasts, male and women, white and black, who were arriving at a unique way of making paintings and thinking about what purpose paintings had generally. And so during the Second World War, probably, roughly the early 1940s, a number of American artists were particularly trying to remove the residue of European modernism, Picasso, Matisse, a very noble cause, because so much American art before the war, as good as it was very much indebted to those figures, Picasso, Matisse, and Miro. Juan Miro would be the three main, probably among others, Duchamp and, a surrealist or two. They were probably the most important European artists in terms of influencing the course of world art, and particularly American art. And so once that becomes known to these artists who are very serious about making their own vision, you got to get that off your back. And so how you back the truck up and try to find a different way of making images, or not making images, or working abstractly, these artists started to do individually and then ultimately collectively. By the time of the end of the war, by 1945, 48, they had all pretty much found their style. But what they decided to do was to, first of all, work in an abstract idiom, but not the most typical European view of abstraction was geometry, very tight geometric shapes, usually squares or cubes if you're making sculpture, faceted planes of three-dimensional shapes that Cubism and Picasso had been so important in inventing. But making an expressionistic abstraction, something that was looser, probably less controlled, had demonstrated more freedom. We can talk more about that, had less rules probably than European abstraction. That was really the contribution that these American artists started to make. And remembering the state of Europe after the war too, the notion of European artists being able to prioritize an avant-garde at that time was pretty ridiculous. Probably half of the European avant-garde moved to the United States or south of France or other places in Europe to get out of the main, bombardments and so forth. But the drone of modern art was starting to be diminished by the war. And what's really interesting is that these American artists were the ones to sort of take it up again after the war with an incredibly bold, monumental, influential new way of looking at painting. And Clyfford Still was absolutely a part of that. He was really the first to arrive at an expressionistic abstraction of all those figures. First doesn't necessarily mean the best. But he was working almost entirely on the West Coast, a few trips here and there. But eventually he got drawn into the New York art world right after the war. And then that's how he had his ideas. He was warmly sort of accepted by his New York contemporaries because they thought what this guy was doing out in the West was, pretty advanced and more advanced even than what they were doing. So he was very much part of the group at the beginning, but as you probably know, within 5 years, he would be very disinterested in being part of a school or a manner of painting and really wanted to be an individual, probably like they all did to various degrees.
In the documentary, they kind of alluded to the fact that he felt like Rothko and some of the other ones kind of stopped growing because they used the term actually, sold out. And where he was more interested in like continue to grow and to change and to express himself, in different ways, maybe.
Yeah, most of the artists who lived long enough, this is a group of artists who, are characterized by, in some respects, hard drinking, philandering, tragic, mythic American deaths like car crashes and other things. So there was there was a kind of, approach that Still knew he didn't want. And I think Still really didn't want to put the control of anything into other people's hands. And I think that's what's really difficult when you're broke. None of them had money, whether it was during the Depression or afterwards. When there's the prospect of selling your art, no matter how much you care for it, and what you're doing, want to protect it, it's not a hard seduction, I think, to start to be brought into the commercial side of it and all the evils that might be attached to that. So it was really, again, even to this day, a pretty unusual example of someone, deciding to do it another way.
And he was a guy that pretty much stayed the course his entire lifetime. He just never was willing to play that game that all the other ones,
Yeah. And it's not that the other ones, like those that lived long enough, I guess to finish up on what I was going to say, a lot of them did have really good later careers too, but they were very connected to the social aspect of being an artist, which Still didn't care about at all. Not that that's a good or a bad thing, but certainly the pressures that sales and, certain aspects of what we might call even selling yourself out, could and probably does come back in ways that you didn't anticipate. It ends up on the walls of people that have absolutely no interest or awareness. And, particularly this notion of a kind of interior decorator, steps in and peppers every Park Avenue penthouse with an abstract expressionist painting, which kind of happened in the 1960s, 50s and 60s. So, none of these people knew what was going to happen. They just wanted to make the best paintings they could, but sure enough, it found an audience.
So one of the things, and I don't know, I'm maybe kind of jumping the gun here, but, everybody's heard of Pollock, I think. Less probably have heard of Rothko. De Kooning is very popular, but still, I really didn't really know of him as much. I recognized some of his paintings when I started looking up his work, but he wasn't really a household name that I would consider, not like Pollock. I mean, everybody knows Pollock. Why do you think, I think you've kind of answered it, but man, like Pollock, just like he is the man when it comes to abstract expressionism. Why him? And
these are very good questions, and you're absolutely right on every front. From the very beginning, Pollock probably was the most original. If you know those poured and drip paintings as maybe a bit of a limiting way of working amongst all the abstract expressionists. It was incredible, and some of the greatest paintings of the 20th century were made by Jackson Pollock. But he was the what I call poster boy. I mean, he really was the one who got the attention, and particularly in Life magazine, got the first gallery attention, commercial attention. He was really the leader in the public sense. But then died tragically, and to die in 1956 at the age of 44, that's pretty Hollywood stuff too. So there is this myth and all this other stuff attached to Pollock that makes him, there was a major motion picture starring Ed Harris in 2001, I think, or 2000. So that, that's how you become a household name. like Van Gogh. It had all those sort of great bits and pieces in the narrative. But the story for Still is really, something in his own hands. He drops out of the art world in the early 50s, just when they're all going up pretty fast. He could sense, I'm going to get off at this stop because I can see what's coming. And he had other reasons for doing that too. But the fact that he started to manage his own affairs that early in his career, and then did it all the way up to the end of his life. So even in the 70s, he was very restrictive about how his work could be shown, and he owned virtually all of it. So that isn't a recipe for fame and notoriety. And then the big clinker in the story is when he died. Mrs. Still, bless her for picking Denver, but Mrs. Still didn't let anybody see it. She waited around for the phone to ring, like I said, and she didn't let people organize exhibitions. From what was 95% of everything he made, we haven't mentioned that, it was a really intact body of work. So Mrs. Still, I think, did ultimately, and especially for people, of our generation and younger and older, it was those 24 years before the museum opened in 2011, but since his death, and probably the 30 years before that, when Still was already, a kind of independent figure that, no one on the ground walking today probably had any real relationship with his art in the way that they did with all these other figures. So it's really, it's really unfortunate that sometimes Still is described or considered a kind of outlying figure of the movement. He is there in the first 5 years. He is there at every, important moment and was participating in the art establishment. His paintings were going into museums by the 50s and 60s and so forth. But when no one's showing your work for 30 years, like in the 80s and 90s, when the art world was exploding in ways we, couldn't imagine, and Still's work is all locked up in a barn in Maryland or a house in Maryland, we're lucky to have heard of him at all, I think, in some respects. A testament to how great the work is, I think.
Yeah. Oh, it's phenomenal. And I have never even seen it in person. So I've been blown. Like, I wrote a scathing review, part of my art history thing, right? An essay on what you hate and what you like. I'm a John Singer Sargent huge fan.
Great artist.
Jackson Pollock and Mondrian. I just thought it was junk. And then I married an artist, and she corrected my ways. But when I first saw Jackson Pollock's piece in a museum, I was blown away, and it totally changes. So yeah. I know Still's work is on a grandiose scale too. So I can't wait to be able to come down to Denver once you're reopened and actually see this stuff. And because I know I'm going to be like even more blown away but I've grown as an art appreciator immensely because of this.
That's the case with all works of art, the Mona Lisa, anything, you need to see it in person. But the other point I would make about that is, and this is, I think, also surprising to people, is Still had a major museum retrospective at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1979. He actually did have a number of lifetime museum exhibitions, but they were always where he could have significant control, usually curated them, usually had almost 100% control in the catalogs and so forth. And his work is, and was before the Denver project, is in most, if not all, of the great museums. MoMA had 2, the Met actually had 1, and then Mrs. Still gave 10, and they acquired a few more. Globally, London, Australia, Germany, they're all over, but there's something about fame that doesn't draw your attention to it in the same way if it's a name you don't know or you don't know the backstory, particularly if it's an interesting backstory like Jackson Pollock and Vincent van Gogh. So, it's a complicated rubric, of how artists be. And I don't think artists are that famous. I always say, compared to sports figures and reality TV stars, artists aren't famous, not even today. Yeah.
Yeah.
So because the way that he operated his art career, and nobody knew him as well as some of his peers. I saw in the documentary, the Dennis Scholl documentary Lifeline, he was kind of relegated to the second tier. But the reality of it is, well, that was kind of made mention.
Yeah, no, I think by some, and it's kind of, I think when people don't really know, it's easier to say that than to say he was the greatest of them all. So I think that's absolutely true.
But at the same time, I would venture to say, and this is obviously my own personal opinion, that he really quite feasibly was the greatest of them all. He definitely had a different, he had a lot of integrity when it came to his art. But he also, when he arrived in New York, it changed everything for all those guys that were, all his peers that were painting at that time. He was kind of that catalyst that kind of pushed them into a whole different realm.
Yeah.
And Jackson Pollock, who we just talked about and was so widely known, he very much admired Clyfford Still.
Yes, the art world was kind of small and quaint then. There weren't that many galleries showing American contemporary art, let alone, modern art. But it was not hard probably to get some notice because the audience wasn't that big anyways. Most avant-gardes, it's other artists or dancers or whatever the art form is. And then, there starts to be some critical acclaim, then maybe some commercial acclaim. And then by the time collectors start to grow, but it's a rather, typical situation, but Still's world was much smaller in New York, especially. And so it's always easy to, I think, shorthand names. It was really frustrating to me where it's always Pollock, Rothko, de Kooning or something. It's like, can't you, be more creative and think of another, like a woman, throwing a woman's name in there once in a while. But it's really, I could argue for Still's greatness. Pollock was certainly the most original in that respect. No one else could paint like that, and no one serious, unless you're appropriating it for another reason. No one painted like Jackson Pollock ever again. People like de Kooning, certain aspects of de Kooning and Franz Klein and some others, the more gestural, kind of prototypical abstract expressionist image when you think of it. That was very influential, and there were a lot of people that painted like that. Eventually, with de Kooning being the kind of founder of that more gestural 2-inch brush mode of working. But you really can't get a sense of the movement without Pollock at one end, Rothko at the other, maybe Barnett Newman, the more color field artists like Still in the middle, and probably some one or two others filtered in, Lee Krasner and so forth. So it's a little more complicated than you've seen Jackson Pollock and the whole movement. It would be like not the Renaissance even. I think there's other examples where it's their differences that are so interesting, yet they all do fit somewhat conveniently under this label of abstract expressionism. They all fit nicely. And I think, Still wouldn't like it, and most of them didn't, but honestly, they did do a lot of very similar things, even though the paintings don't always look alike. They were, in many ways, a number of ways, were approaching painting in very similar processes.
So who was Clyfford Still? How does a man that's born in Grandin, North Dakota, become this phenomenal artist?
You get out of North Dakota, with all due respect to those of you, but it's not uncommon. Whether it's Chicago, Still went to San Francisco. We'll get there in a second, or New York. I mean, really, usually it's these moments where artists say, "I'm going to make a run for it too." I think oftentimes theater majors, right after school, you're going to go to New York and be part of that, because it's hard to be great in Denver or Rapid City, or pick your places. It's just not the center of all that activity, or it's not the big pond, And Still made his way. His family actually grew up in Washington State, so near Spokane. They homesteaded in southern Alberta, Canada. Not that that's improving his chances of being famous, by the way, but he gets on the West Coast and then teaches at Washington State College in the 1930s, late 30s into the early 40s. And then he goes to San Francisco, which was a place with some talented people, curators. There was a modern art museum there. And that's really where he first made his mark, was in San Francisco. And then, once you're there, then there's a much easier trajectory or, ride to fame. But, he had to finally get to a major art center, art capital in a certain way. In the United States, San Francisco was a really, especially in the 40s when he was there, it was a very important place for photographers, painters. And I have argued, and I think I'm right, I would challenge anyone, he was really probably the most important artist working on the West Coast after the war. Not to say that he couldn't be the greatest American painter in those same years because he was making such incredible leaps so much in advance of his colleagues, but he certainly was the most important artist working on the West Coast. Los Angeles really hadn't, for a variety of reasons, Hollywood and other things, LA was not really much of an art town at that point. On the West Coast, it was San Francisco and other places.
I want to circle back real quick. It's pretty significant that we have the largest body of his work here in a whole museum dedicated to him. And you kind of mentioned Denver earlier as far as not being an art epicenter per se, but really Colorado's really played a huge part in art in America. Am I correct in stating that?
Well, yes, and I don't know if it's always Colorado generally, but, the Rocky Mountain region certainly for, a few hundred years. But, there's also anything that isn't New York, at least after a certain point. It's really the abstract expressionists that turn New York into the capital of art. The art world that we know today, well, it's probably certainly more globalized. But New York, was what it was and wanted to be the place where Andy Warhol would work and would want to stay. It wasn't always that way. And so, there is... whatever's not happening in New York has to be looked at as carefully as what's happening in the major cities, because that's where you find the richness and more variation into what we mean American art is. So, I think it's always a fool's game to look, just to Paris, in the teens or something. It's always more rich and more complicated than that.
Is there any artist that has documented as much of their art career in America as Clyfford Still did? Because he seemed like he documented everything. He had a tape recorder, and he would go on these long, it was like a written essay of what he thought and his opinions of where art was at the time. And then he had photographs, and he made notes. And then his wife was a huge part of that as well, as far as documenting all the different all of his different pieces.
Normally, and this probably happened more, in the 50s and 60s, but normally a dealer would do all that for you. That's sort of why they get 50% of the commission, or 50% commission. But, I think it was also the curse of living a while and moving around. In the 1960s, so Still had been, a very serious artist for at least 30 years, maybe 35 years. He and his wife and their family actually sat down and decided to inventory it and photograph it. And it's really at that point moving forward that it started to be, thought of as a organic living thing that has to be cared for and fed a little bit. So it was almost out of necessity, but knowing, he did not having a dealer to sort of do it for you. And knowing by the late 60s and certainly into the 70s, that he was going to give it all, give the rest of it away. I think there was also that same vision for, let's give it away in a rather tidy way, and all the supporting archival materials as well. So there was some thought put into it based on what he knew he wanted to do with it. So that probably explains it as well. But most artists, I think, serious artists, and for a variety of reasons, do try to keep track of it. It's not always so easy, and certainly over centuries that gets a little difficult. But I think there is a sense to, particularly for important artists, and artists are interested in what they did and so forth. I think keeping track of it isn't so unusual, but the Still's approach to it and the reasons for doing it and the size of the body of work is pretty remarkable, I think.
So there's going to the recording. There's like 36 hours of recording. Is that right? Or maybe that's
Yeah. And you brought that up too. Even the tape recordings, I think some of that was just fun. I was around in the 70s and cassette players. They had reel to reel too. But you got those things. You got to record something on it. It wasn't so good for recording television shows so you recorded your musings and your thoughts and your playing the piano. So we didn't know we were getting Super 8 film and audio recordings because we had been asking the children for a variety of reasons, what's in the archives. And it was really a surprise when that was unearthed that we had the only and first moving imagery. So the Super 8s to actually see how he carries himself and how he interacted with people. Because all we had were these photographs, these very grandiose, sometimes mythic, romantic images of the great artist. And so that was really fun to have that. And then the recordings, even tell us more about what was on his mind and, what it was like to be Clyfford Still.
Is there any plan to release those in a format that a person can listen to?
Yeah, I don't know if all 30 hours are available on our website. If you go to, it's under the museum and then research and so forth. I know a fair amount of it is accessible now because it's really easy. Well, I shouldn't say that it's easy to digitize. The Super 8 films were degraded and could only be copied once. You couldn't watch them and then decide, let's digitize them next. So those went straight to the digitization lab. But once it's digitized, you save the originals. They're going to degrade into nothing over, the next couple lifetimes. But it's pretty easy to make it accessible. We all listen to audio on our computers every day. So it wasn't hard for us once you got it all digitized to make it available. So a lot of that material, kind of everything we're talking about is on our website or linkable from our website.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to do a deeper dive into your website. And then my wife was wondering, because there was the moving pictures, was there any of him painting? Was there any video of him painting?
No, that was good news, bad news when we found it. So most of the Super 8 is just family footage, some travels. But there was a moment when he was in the studio in front of a blank canvas, and it appears as though someone off camera, probably someone holding the camera or else someone up with that person, told him to do something or make a gesture, and he did. And I want to say that portion is 12 seconds or something, and we've slowed it down. And I think Dennis in his film even slowed it down because there's only that little bit. He wasn't the kind of guy that wanted, I don't think most artists want a camera. Once in a while, artists do it. Gerhard Richter did it with some great flair, and others have done it. Pollock even painted on glass with a camera on the underside so we could see him laying down those loops of paint. But I don't know that most creative people want someone to be there while they're making things.
Yeah, it would have been cool to watch him paint one of those. Just to see how he did it,
I wish we had it. You and I agree. I wish we had it, but we don't.
Yeah.
Furthering the mystery, though, some of these things we have to guess based on conservation evidence, or we know he was right-handed, and so this mark probably went, from lower left to upper right, and so forensics evidence reveals a lot too.
Yeah,
his early work was more representational. And it's really unique, and it's beautiful work as well. Obviously, he's known for the abstract expressionism. Do you have all the early work that he did? Is that in the museum's possession?
Yeah, the early work probably he saved what he wanted to save. We have a lot of records about paintings that were lost and destroyed, and in other correspondence we learn about other paintings that we think are no longer in existence, but things do resurface, sometimes hundreds of years later. Happens all the time. But there is a kind of, he cleaned it up too, that when we got it, it was pretty clear what the development was, and you could get the sense, he must have made more paintings in 1931 than what we have. I think we have one painting. So I think it's much more abridged in the early years, and then pretty much everything was saved or sold and documented at that point. But there's only about 100 paintings, many, many more drawings than works on paper, but about 100 paintings before what we would call the breakthrough, when he starts to be a expressionistic abstract artist. So that's not bad. That's a good, there's other things in the world that we don't own, but we show more of those consistently because there's just fewer of them. Those early, there's landscapes and images of farm settings and farm workers and so forth. And then they start to get really interesting where you don't know quite what you're looking at. Is that the landscape or a farm worker? But that transitional period would be in that 100 paintings too, roughly. And
then his most prolific period was after his third stage, right? Was after, is that correct?
As far as we know, yeah. He sold very little of it. And when he moves to Maryland late in the early 60s, when he was about 54, I think, actually a little older than that, he had nothing but time to paint. So more paintings were made, mostly because he didn't have the same distractions. Having lived in New York for 11 years before that, where he still made a fair number of work. He probably made on average about 30 paintings a year. Does that sound like a lot or a little? That's probably a typical number. But what I know of other artists, certainly, where there's large bodies of work that we could count up, that's probably not a lot. It's 2 a month, sort of, and it's not always 30 years. Sometimes it's less, sometimes 40. But that doesn't seem like he was lazy or just cranking it out either. That's probably a good pace.
Yeah.
Well, and he was also working in this large scale too, so that has to be a consideration as well.
Yeah, no question about it. Some of them physically would just take a while to make too. And the whole notion of filming the artist doing it, I think a lot of painters would know that the act of painting is often, and particularly for these guys, you put something down for 10 minutes and then you sit and look at it for 10 hours. De Kooning's rocking chair is a mythic kind of perch where de Kooning did nothing but stared at the paintings, wondering. It was very intuitive, but also very classical. They were making compositions about balance or asymmetry or color or non-color. And, they just thought and looked very hard at them. So people always ask, how long did it take him to make it? It's like, well, you mean if you edited out all the periods where there wasn't a hand on a canvas, not that long. But in terms of, coming the next day and looking at it and, that experience in the morning, having your coffee, looking at what you did yesterday, you can imagine there were some tough mornings, and you'd scratch out a whole part, start again. That's just the nature of any artist, though.
Yeah,
most good artists.
I thought there was an interesting story towards the end of his life, if I remember correctly, and it's documented in the Lifeline. I think it's his daughter Diane tells a story where she finds him. He's kind of sitting on the edge of his bed. He's a little agitated, and she goes in to kind of comfort him and ask him what's wrong. And he's like, I don't think people get my stuff. I have this desire to just go out and just burn all these paintings that I've done because I don't know that people get me and get it. It's amazing to me that for someone that seems so self-assured, he still had that thing that a lot of artists have where he has that self-doubt. Like, does this even mean anything?
Yeah, we don't see that a lot. And, again, maybe some of the archives was, cleaned up or something. But it is always for an artist like Still, not shocking, but surprising when once in a while you do hear about or he even writes about or tells someone about those human elements, where, and I think particularly being, I always think being famous is a curse. It's really fun on the way up, but once you get there, and this is in a number of other occupations and art forms, certainly, but once you get there, where do you go from there? You've already reached the pinnacle of success, however you define that, I suppose. But then how you keep recreating and being original is harder the second time. They always talk about, I invented fire, isn't that good enough? Do I have to do something else? And I think that's what kind of killed Pollock too, is, it was such a burst of originality that how could anyone top that? And everything that came after 1950 for Pollock is looked at as somewhat disappointing. And I think that contributed a lot to his ultimate failure as an artist of the 1950s.
Wow.
And as a person, probably too.
Yeah.
Do you think that was part of the reason that it sounded like he moved around a lot, and it wasn't necessarily about the destination, but maybe just moving, he felt like it kept the juices flowing, and the fact that he extracted himself from the New York scene where there would be, you know, any road you could take as far as the fame and fortune and stuff, just keeping it simple and extracting himself from that scenario, that kept him original and kept him so prolific even through his later years?
I think it helped. It's interesting. He, being from the, Eastern Washington, the plains of Washington State and Alberta, probably driving 6 or 8 hours wouldn't be so unusual. A lot of his moves early in his career, like before he finally settles it in New York in 1950, where he stays for 11 years, some of that was for jobs. He didn't want to take government money under FDR's New Deal, the Federal Art Project, WPA programs, things like that. Which he could have done. So he was moving for teaching positions because he, didn't have another way to survive, selling avant-garde art or these, figures of farmers with bloodied arms that weren't probably so marketable on most people's, for most people's walls. But then when he settled down, I think there's probably something to, really digging in and throwing away the packing boxes and just focusing. And I think that's certainly what happened in New York, even though he was disappointed by what he was met with when he moved to New York, but it certainly had everything he needed to be an artist. And then finally in Maryland too, it was a place where he only wanted to make his art, maybe, treat his grandkids to car rides and things. But it was a kind of monastic existence for Still because he wasn't that social, like a lot of people are, let alone artists.
Right. Space seems to play a huge part in his art and his pieces. Do you think that has to do with where he grew up in his early pivotal years? And then it seems to be like a continuing theme throughout the rest of his life.
Yeah, it's hard to say absolutely. You don't know where this stuff comes from sometimes. But yes, I think you're on a good path because there is something about probably artists who grow up in urban areas or work in urban areas. There's just a different quality of light and there's a different example of space. So I think certainly where he was had an impact on his art. But there's also, it still was very astute in the history of art. He knew all the great traditions and sometimes not, minor traditions as well. And most great artists, most great creative people are in fact the kind of, cumulative collective of all that stuff that comes before. And a lot of times you save little bits of things that you detect in other earlier art, but you use it in a new and novel way. And so the notions of space could have been in any number of other precedents to what Still did. So I think equal to that, it would be his engagement with the ideas of painting, coupled with his, the almost romantic tradition of grandeur, whether that's in Ansel Adams photographs or in romantic landscape or American Hudson River Valley paintings. There is this notion of being able to depict something even more grand. That's why, painting becomes such an interesting medium. It isn't exactly what artists see. It's what they want us to see, or what, is even better, improved on from the, rather mundane aspects of the scene world. Artists really have the ability to, make us see new things. Hopefully. Sometimes.
Art is always open to interpretation and to the viewer. And in the documentary Lifeline, they talk with Jerry Saltz, and he alludes to that, it's not just about the artist, that it's about the viewer. The artist doesn't own the art.
Yeah.
It's everybody's perception of what
Correct.
that means and what it is. I would like to see a conversation between Clyfford Still and this Jerry Saltz. I think that would be an interesting conversation to be a part of. But yeah. I thought his perspective on being an art critic was really interesting. And
yes,
Wes, you kind of, were kind of interested in that whole aspect as well.
Yeah, and a couple things. Well, I thought Still's comments were really good. And the one that got me the most, like it just like hit me in the face, was what makes Clyfford Still a pretty great artist is you and I and Clyfford are looking at different paintings when we look at them.
Yes.
And better yet, they change every time.
Yes.
And that comment, I think, really speaks to Clyfford's artwork, because, you know, when you look at it, I know what Clyfford was looking at and what I'm looking at are totally different things. Yeah. But I get the feeling that if I went back to him a year or 5 years from now, I'd see something totally different.
Yes. And I think that's what makes great art too. You know, that idea of a one-liner, whether or not, you know, that could be a filmmaker. They just do one thing and they just keep, you know, grinding it into the earth. Probably most, you know, good or great art functions based on that, is that it, you know, shows us something, if not new, shows us something that we need or want to see. Van Gogh's Starry Night, you know, how many times can you see that and ever be bored looking at it? It's just one example, a popular example. But, you know, similarly, still, if the artist is going to explain it, it's not mathematics. You can't reduce it to a basic explanation. Most good artists will say things about the work, but it's never quite the way, I don't want to say lazy viewers or people that don't want to think on their own, but let's face it, it's useful if you can get a synopsis or some kind of hook to hang your coat on, you know, when you look at a painting. And, you know, I don't think any artist would ever want their work explained, or as a, you know, artist would say, if I could explain it, I'd write it, but I'm a painter and it's not meant to be explained. And so I think sometimes we put a unrealistic expectation on artists to tell us what it is we're seeing or what his feelings were or why he made it. We can answer those questions reasonably well. A colleague of mine said something that I think is very, very funny but very important, that the abstract expressionists refused to explain what their work was about, and then they complained when everybody got it wrong. And so there is that, you know, almost that intentionality about it. And, you know, I would hate to have Still come back and read our, you know, text labels. He would, you know, as Woody Allen would say, you know, he would never stop throwing up, you know, if he read what we say about it today. His daughters, I'm often a little concerned about, but they seem to be good sports about it. And often they agree, you know, you're not, like if we really said something asinine, they would perhaps ask us about it. It would be our choice whether to leave it up or not. But, you know, the whole problem is even greater when we're dealing with abstract art. You know, if it's photographic realism, and the goal is to make it look exactly like what your eye sees, it's pretty easy to tell how successful that artist was. You know, you can quibble about the drawing or the color, but, you know, generally you know what the goal is there, where the goal is so unknown with these artists. You know, what am I comparing this to? And I think with abstract art, that gets really difficult.
And I definitely fall into that, maybe a lazy art appreciator. I would look at it, and if I didn't understand it, I'd be like, I don't get it, and walk away. But
that's
I think
a male thing, by the way.
What's that?
That's a male thing.
Oh, is it?
Man, no, I'm only slightly kidding, but working in art museums for so long and, you know, looking at visitors, we won't get into that, but I think sometimes that's a male response as opposed to a female response, where not knowing something starts to become an interesting emotion, where I think for many men, for a variety of cultural and other reasons, not knowing something makes us feel, you know, inadequate. Let's just not get too Freudian there. Yeah.
There. No. And I'll tell you, I've learned, I think I just need to sit with it and just look at it and observe it and let it come to me.
But again, I think so many visitors, there's something, we talked about money before we went on the air. No, there's something about the obstacles to being able to look. My kid could do it. It's worth a lot of money, and that money could be better put, you know, towards COVID relief. Or no one should make that much money for making a painting, you know, and I don't make that much. Or teach, you know, there's so many things that are preventing you from looking at the painting. before you ever look at the painting, that I often feel like it's a tough job I'm in. I think it's hard to get people to warm up these days because of the, sensationalism of money and the skepticism that so many people have about modern art.
And I was one of those that said, if I think I can do it, then it's not art. And when I was looking at Pollock and Mondrian, especially Mondrian, I'm like, oh my God, they're squares. How hard is that? But the difference is, I finally pointed out to myself, is that not only you may be able to do it, but I bet you can't do it. And number one, you didn't think of it.
Yeah. And your intentions for doing it were not what Mondrian's intentions was to create a modern art idiom that transcended, time and place and was a link to a higher consciousness, and to make a painting that looks like that in 1920 for those reasons. And they're actually very well painted, and I couldn't make one personally. I've taped off enough squares and, living rooms and rec rooms. You couldn't make it anyways, even if you could. Most people think they could. Yeah, it's harder than it looks.
As someone that has spent all this time with these phenomenal works, I assume that as you do tours, that every time out or every so often you'll look at a piece, maybe you've looked at it 100 times, and all of a sudden you'll see something you never saw before.
Yes, we do a program that we've done since our first months open called One Painting at a Time, which is a 30-minute or so gallery experience with just one work. I think I gave the first one, and I've done 2 more since then over almost 10 years. But the being in the audience and just having that one work and looking at a painting that I thought I knew really well is changed most on what I hear from other people who are presenting it, but also just staring and looking at it. One of the ideas that I've always wanted to try, but we've never done it for some practical reasons, was a one-work gallery, where literally that's all you had at a bench, and the requirement is to look at this picture. We have a lot of skylights at the museum, very sophisticated natural light systems coming in. And, during extended periods, the lighting on these paintings, these surfaces, these wonderful oiled surfaces can change right before your eyes. So it becomes much more interesting than what you see in a JPEG on our website. That's a very, very different experience they really come alive when you see them in person, where they become images in reproduction. And those images are strong and wonderful, but they're not the same thing as seeing its textures and its subtle differences and the mastery of a painter's touch too, we call it. There is something to how every artist, just paints a little differently, or they have a certain, way of working with paint that's just beautiful, and Still would be one of those.
So let's discuss that for a second. What was his process? I read that it wasn't all just brushes, that he had other techniques that he used compared to other people.
Yeah, and again, we don't know all of the process probably changes, but let's just say for the classic abstract expressionist period, he probably had something of an idea what he was going to do. Rarely, but sometimes he would there was a drawing and he would then enlarge it in a painting, but rarely. We have, in the collection, we have 2,600 drawings. A handful, you wouldn't even call them studies probably, but a handful relate directly to then a painting. But interestingly, he would then make a drawing after a painting too, so that whole cycle gets a little confused and sideways. But it becomes very intuitive. I think oftentimes a lot of artists, and Still include, I think, put his blacks down first, some of the big forms, see what needs to be done next. Probably had a certain idea of colors because he had to mix it up. He made all of his own paint, so had a certain idea about colors. Scale, you had to have a stretch, or if you didn't have it stretched, you had to have a basic understanding of how big. Although sometimes artists change their mind during that process, let a little more canvas out or cut it down during that process. So it's when you made 800 paintings too, everyone's probably a little different, that process. But drawing, doesn't play the role I think people wish it did, that it's a step to something else. Drawings were their own individual, unique, creative expressions, usually for modern artists and many others. And, he would go back and rework them. We have dates, 1963, 66. He worked on it for in 1 year and then came back to it 3 years later. Trying to think of other examples, makes different versions of the image. He makes one and then does another one in a slightly different way. I always say it's like a musician doing it at a different tempo. It's the same score, same notes, but, do it with a little less volume, painterly volume. So, it's a very serious and very old-fashioned practice. Even though they're avant-garde images, the way he made paintings isn't that different from the way most painters made paintings before him. At base level, what the image looks like at the end is very different, but he was pretty traditional like that compared to what will happen with Warhol in the 60s, photo silk screening, or any number of other artists, Mark Bradford, collaging as much with papers as opposed to actual oil paint or any oil paint. So, relatively speaking, and what would come after, he's an old, kind of old masterish traditional painter.
And I read too that abstract expressionism gets subcategorized in the two different things into action painting and like color field painting, I guess it is. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is somewhat like all of us, we try to oversimplify, but I think it's useful. And I teach abstract expressionism and always qualify, but I think there are those, or I know there are those painters that were called in the 1950s action painters because their marks were usually the result of some kind of physical activity. A lot of painting before abstract expressionism was painting of the wrist. You're just simply making dots, or a very controlled. It wasn't the painting of the arm, or in the case of Pollock, laying canvases on the ground, the whole body, performative, moving around all four sides. And so there's, something to think about it. I think that respect too is that, the way they moved their arm around had a big result in how we receive their images. So people like Pollock and de Kooning, who is more gestural, I think are certainly fine examples if you want to call it action painting, gesture painting. Rothko, who was much less interested in a kind of surface of paint being built up, but very thin layers, built up in almost glazes, very transparent layers that start to create color fusions that our eyes can't even detect the differences often. They're so subtle. He would be more on that kind of quieter, not particularly gestural side of the spectrum. And then Still is kind of in between. He uses large areas of color. Pollock really didn't. They were more linear, at least those classic paintings. So Still and Rothko were these kind of field artists. And Still especially these huge fields of black, yellow, red, bigger than most paintings were before that time, let alone just that one color occupied. Like we have a 13-foot painting that's all black. Another one that's all red, another one that's all blue. So color field isn't a terrible descriptor. It's just, there's always exceptions to every label, whatever you're going to put on it. But yeah, those are nice, convenient, and often very useful ways of breaking down that movement. So in understanding the whole movement, you can't just have all the gesture guys, your Pollocks and de Koonings, the stereotypical abex. So you really do need Barnett Newman and Mark Rothko and some others to fill in the range of what those artists did.
You get access to paintings at times of the day that no one else gets access to, and you get to see things that other people, that the public doesn't generally get to observe. There's a great story in that documentary Lifeline where they're talking with Tom Healy, the writer. He talks about going to I can't think of the name of the museum in Buffalo.
The Albright Knox Art Gallery.
Yes, Albright Knox, excuse me. Thank you. And he's in there and he's just enamored with these still paintings, and the electricity goes off. And there's a great quote from Still that says, "Turn off the lights and the paintings have their own fire." And he said that when he experienced that, he could feel that. He could feel that emotion or that radiating from these paintings. Have you experienced that yourself?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting quote of Still's. You can turn the lights out, the paintings carry their own flame or have their own fire. But Tom Healy's story was new to me, where someone was actually in a room of paintings when the lights went out. But when we were designing the museum, our architect was very, very interested, since we were putting in skylights and very sophisticated skylights, in having that, not only the variance that you see under different climactic conditions, but also the way in Colorado, especially at other places, it's just so bright outside, and probably a lot of museums, maybe less so now with a greater sense of preservation, but a lot of galleries and other places overlight. You're so used to seeing things really bright. And so the notion of seeing things in darker rooms really is only possible if you sit and let your eyes adjust to it too. Like Tom Healy's story, I think, was a condition. The lights went out and they were, okay, everybody stand still, don't bump into anything. And you basically adjusted to this new, as our eyes were so good at. One of the things our architect did, which a lot of visitors don't realize, is the lobby and the path you make through the ticketing process and going to the restrooms. Everything on the main floor is very dark, not even relatively speaking, just dark. For better or worse. And so when you ascend upstairs and the daylight takes over, your eyes are so relaxed, you're so sensitive to light at that point that a little bit of daylight gives you a lot of bang for your buck. And so there is a kind of sophistication in architectural design and how you can bring in natural light and not rely only on electric artificial light.
And you yourself were integral in helping choose the architect. Is that correct? And the design of the museum?
Yeah, it was a competition. Brad Clyfford and his firm, Allied Works Architecture out of New York and Portland, was unanimous choice. It was always a tough decision. But it was a architect who knew what the role of architecture could be in a museum like this. Like, the paintings had their own fire and they had their own textures and they had their own mass and experience. And how do you make an architecture that supports that and seems complementary and certainly not distracting? I think there are enough examples of architecture that does distract, particularly art museum architecture that distracts from your ability. And there's personal taste there too. Some people like big rooms, some people like little rooms. And so, what we did, we thought was right for this collection. And as much as I think Impressionist paintings and old master paintings would look good in those spaces, there are other kinds of spaces that show those paintings really well too. So we were really focused on, one body of work and didn't have to worry about what other things would look like in those spaces.
It's a really beautiful space. Can you take a moment and kind of describe to people that might be listening halfway across the world or somewhere in the nation and didn't even know about the Clyfford Still Museum in Denver?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to see online, so Google it and you'll see the building pretty easily. But it's a cast-in-place concrete structure. So instead of I-beams or concrete piers and then things are attached to it and you sort of build a structure out of it, the concrete was cast in place, sometimes 45-foot tall pours, lifts they call them. And then that structure defined the interior spaces to a certain degree, particularly the galleries, because certain galleries have concrete walls in them. So those structural walls are also hanging walls. But also it became the skin, the exterior of the building. So nothing is screwed to it or hung to it, like curtain wall construction, they call it in architecture. It's the physical exterior of the building too. So in that respect, it's rather straightforward, not ornamental or decorative in any way. It's a very honest, and concrete is a very plain material, even though we've cast it in we think a lovely way. It's not even limestone or, other types of architectural finishes that are very showy in a certain way, marble or other even applied stone. So it's following up on a quote that Mark Rothko made of Clyfford Still's work, hearing Still say it himself, it's of the earth. There's something about his rough textures of his paintings. And, oil paints, pigments really come from the earth, always have. And so there's something about that earthiness and being grounded in the Denver landscape that I think was important for our project too.
And kind of just speaks to from where he was from,
Yeah, and I think
kind of his roots,
Yeah, our architect knew to not just look at the paintings, but to look at the setting where Still grew up. And I think there's also that embedded in the building was how our architect was one from the Northwest, being in Portland, but was very interested in where Still grew up and what he would have been exposed to, the Columbia River Valley and redstone monuments and things. So it's a really interesting artist to try to build a museum around, I think, too.
Yeah. So how often do you change exhibits?
3 times a year, pretty religiously. January, May, and what am I forgetting? September, more or less. Yeah, and we think that's a pretty good pace. Because of COVID, we ended up having to close, and we're going to put our show back out again. And then we may not change them around quite that fast, just because fewer people will be in, just because of occupancy restrictions from governments and so forth. So we may change that in 2021. Probably we'll change it, but maybe we won't have to. But we may slow that down a little bit just so people can get in and see the shows.
And then, how many pieces are generally released at one time?
Yeah, it's an interesting, less than you would think. Our first show, I was amazed, had about 50 paintings and about 50 drawings. So and most of those drawings were all in one room because drawings being so small. So that's probably a lot. We probably show closer to 70 or 80 things because we don't show that many drawings at one time. But, the last 4 or 5 rooms probably have 4 or 5 paintings in them, maybe 6. And so there's a lot of space around them too. Where at the very beginning, when the paintings are 2 by 3 feet, you might have 14 paintings in one gallery. But by the end, it really is almost, at least the way we've been using the space, 1 painting per wall almost. 1 big painting on 1 big wall is kind of all you need to do.
And do you cover each period of his life?
Yes, we try to. Yeah, we learned in the first couple of years, and even we still study this. Most of our visitors have never been there before. Like 75% of anyone who walks up on a typical day has never been to the museum. And so, maybe in our second year, we started to get a little flashy and wanting to do these deep theme shows. But then we realized, most of the people here are just here to learn about Still and to see their first stills. And you've got to walk before you learn to run. So I think we always have a little thematic show too. Sometimes not so little. For example, right now, this is the best example. The next show will be 3 galleries of the story, and then the rest of it a thematic show. So there's ways that we can tack on, a thematic show or put it in the middle of that story and not feel like you have to keep score as to what decade you're in. Because it is useful to be coherent for your visitors and make it legible. So we think about that a lot.
Early on in the existence of the museum actually was able to sell some pieces to set up its own endowment.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I try to be very specific because it was a kind of unusual and complex situation, but it had to do with the recession, the Great Recession of 08-09, where we were closing in on raising all the money for the building, but it was looking impossible to do it for the foundation. And so the endowment, which is now in a foundation. And so the estate of Mrs. Still had some still paintings that were given to her when he died. He gave her the control to give the collection to a city, but also gave her some art. And I think we know now intentionally, should she need to sell work to care for that bigger body, she was the executor of the estate. But when it became evident that we were going to have a hard time fulfilling the mission of the museum and everything physically, from stretching all 800 paintings to having conservators and archivists and the technologies and, marketing teams and all that, it would be hard to do that without a sizable endowment, because he wasn't George O'Keeffe or Andy Warhol, household names. So Mrs. Still's estate allowed the city to sell work in advance of the museum opening. So this was all done before the founding of the museum, even though we knew that we would be the beneficiary of those funds. The city and the estate agreed that 4 works would be sold to establish the endowment. And, given that we were getting 825 paintings, letting 4 go didn't seem so painful. And in 3 cases, we've actually borrowed those works back. It wasn't like, they went to another planet. They're still in collections, and we've been fortunate enough to have a relationship with those collectors so that we can even borrow them back if we need that painting to tell a story.
I would imagine you also lend paintings out to other institutions.
That's a little trickier, and that goes back to the one-page will, where he never covered it. And then Mrs. Still never really covered it in quite the way we needed. So it's an interesting story, given that he said, you can't do this and you got to do that. We ended up taking that to lawyers who recommended that we get the permission from the children, the artist children, the city who owns it, and then our board, anyone who would, have the authority to, you just don't want to do it without asking permission when there's some ambiguity about that. And we've only done it once to lend to a major exhibition in London and Bilbao, Spain, at the Guggenheim in Bilbao, where we lent 9 paintings. But we're really glad we did it, because it was kind of a sensation to have these paintings travel to Europe and to be part of this show where still could be brought back into the battle royale with Rothko and Newman and all the other men and women. And so it was actually one of the greatest things I think we were able to do, was to have these paintings go to, as we said at the time, and it may still be the case, more people saw them in those 2 cities in 2016 than had been to Denver to see those same works, for our first 5 years. I mean, 675,000 people saw those paintings. So we think it was worth the trouble to get the permission and to, in some cases, roll them up, take them off the stretchers, roll them up, and get them over there. And they came back fine, but you always are a little worried.
Now, did you help in the curation of those shows?
The one in London was a colleague of mine, a gentleman by the name of David Anfem, who's our senior consulting curator. I was involved in the selection of the stills, but David and I had a very similar, sense of what needed to go over there. So that was a very easy, I think he gave me a list and I said, yeah, looks great. Let's do it. It wasn't difficult in terms of working with David and knowing the collection. But the hardest thing was doing it in 9, it would have been more interesting or a little easier maybe to do it in 30 paintings, but that wasn't going to happen in that respect.
Yeah, to distill it down to 9 paintings, I bet was pretty difficult. Did you get to see both those exhibits?
I did, and it was wonderful. Both, the Guggenheim is a Frank Gehry building, a very wonderful, very deconstructivist building. And then the Royal Academy in London is, the exact opposite. Wainscoting and baseboards and, a 250-year-old, actually a little older than that, building. So it was wonderful to see the stills win in both of those architectural settings. We showed the paintings at the Denver Art Museum in their Daniel Libeskind space, that very expressionistic building, which is yet a different kind of architecture than where they are now at the Still Museum. And it's really interesting to see those paintings in different settings, especially once we open the museum. Is really interesting.
Yeah.
Was that the first time that you were able to see Still's work with Rothko and the other paintings?
Yeah, no, because other, stills that have been in the world, we've seen those together, but it's not common, and especially probably in Europe. Stills better represented in the United States collections, but you don't see it very often. Especially, I think there were 7 or 8 Rothkos. There were 10 stills because they borrowed a 10th one from a collector. So that's pretty incredible. And Still had his own room, so the way you could. Again, see him, the great thing about it was we're doing what we need to do in Denver, but to let him out of his cage once in a while and play with the other children is really important. Important is the word. It's not only fun or useful, but it's important that still is seen in the context of other artists, whether or not he thought that was important or not.
Yeah. From an educational point of view,
Exactly.
it's important.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the, as we've continued through this pandemic here, I know that you are opening up to members first on July 1st. What kind of things can people expect when they go to the Clyfford Still Museum?
Well, fewer people, which I actually think is maybe the greatest thing that could have happened to museums from a visitor standpoint. You know, the economics are not so good having fewer people, but I can't imagine any museum where crowds are preferable. And so the idea of restricting traffic to all the museums that are reopening is, better than being closed, and tough to make the funding work out. But the experiences we'll see over the next, several months going to museums will be really nice. You'll have much quieter spaces. And so the galleries will be the same. A few more signs. We're actually going to do some new text interpretations of art during crisis. Some of the images that's still made in the Depression and in the era of the Second World War are worth reminding people that these paintings were made during times of crisis as well. A lot of our technologies will be turned off because you can't have people touching screens and, moving their hands around on touchscreen panels. So that will be a slightly different experience. But the daylight will be there. The paintings will look great. The benches will still be there. So we think we're excited to reopen, as you might imagine, by this point.
And what does the future hold for the museum? What do you see in the next 9 months to a year? I know you probably have exhibits already planned, but
yeah, more of the same. We've got a lot of exhibitions that we're really excited about. One where we're going to work with educators, both on our staff, but also at various schools and in colleges and universities, with the notion of the young mind. What cognitive abilities and experiences do preschool age children have? We already work with school groups around 4th grade and above, but we want to go younger. And there's a lot of science and a lot of learning that I think Still's collection is very useful for. Large colors, contrast, young minds detect easier. So that's something that I think is going to be really interesting, but won't necessarily change for those people who just want to come and see the normal Still experience. You don't have to necessarily follow our guides or look at it in any particular order. The museum's celebrating its 10th anniversary in 2021. COVID sort of changed some of our thinking about what we're going to do there, but that's pretty exciting. We're hitting adolescence now. We're no longer the new kid on the block. And we also acquired some property in the neighborhood just across the street that, again, COVID is slowing down, and some of our early meetings about what we're going to do there, but not in the next 9 months, but certainly at some point the museum will expand in some way in that property. So that's useful for a lot of reasons.
So 2 separate buildings.
Probably because they're across the street, although, an architect could find a way to,
to connect the two.
Exactly, underground or above ground. So that is even too soon to say that. We're assuming there'll be 2 separate and discrete spaces, but you never know when you get architects around a table.
So is that still in the kind of infancy stage as far as what that's going to be and what that's going to look like, and going to use as an architect? And
our neighborhood is going through a lot of redevelopment and changing very, very quickly. So we were fortunate enough, my board president, Chris Hunt, was fortunate enough in getting us to at least acquire the land, because if you don't have the land, you're in really big trouble. And so we have the land, and we're not in a immediate rush to get going on that, but at least we've got that secured. And then of course, once we got the land, you might as well start planning what you're going to do on it. So once we get out of COVID, that will be a big part of the museum's future.
Now, I know I've seen it made mention that this is, you guys have kind of fulfilled the first phase of the museum. How many phases are there, or how far out is the planning when it comes to a museum, or just Clyfford Still Museum in general?
Yeah, we don't have to plan as far out because a lot of general museums and complicated loan shows, you might have to commit to something 5 years out and then start to put it on a schedule 3 years out. So we're never that far out. Probably 2 years would be a typical planning period. And then, there's often other things that change. Your new staff members come and sort of have different ideas. So it's actually nice not having to plan out that far. Not that those bigger museums can't figure out ways to adapt, but it really is, we're a little more flexible and a little bit more nimble, I think, because like all small museums probably are.
And you touched a little bit on the education stuff that you guys do, which I think is fantastic because you really work a lot with youth and the grade school kids, like you said. Talk about some of the programming. Obviously, it's not happening with COVID right now, but some of the programming.
Yeah, it's interesting. Remotely and all of that. But yeah, it was something that really, it was our education staff that, sort of showed us all at the museum how this collection and this artist can link up with schools of almost any age, whether it's in curriculum or whether in confidence building or literacy skills. But it can range from our what we call gallery experiences. We don't take kids on tours. We actually plunk them down in galleries with activities, and they learn without necessarily moving around that much. The notion of a tour when you're young is a kind of questionable practice. You're seeing way too many things for one visit, way too many artists, being distracted by so many other things, lunchrooms and other school groups and so forth. But also, we do things for populations with special needs. We're involved with something called Spark that a number of other museums are for early onset Alzheimer's individuals, where they can use the collection for, in some ways, having connections with works of art that may not be so easy in other settings. Adult programs, art history lectures, music programs. We work with writing workshops, almost anything that would be sparked by seeing the paintings or the story of Clyfford Still. We have tried, and in some cases have become somewhat ingrained in our education programs. So I'm glad you asked about that.
And you also have a maker space there?
Yeah. That's another funny story. We created what we thought was a really elegant, education space with books and videos and lounge chairs and coffee tables, and no one used it. There was no there. And so our education director decided let's change it up a little bit. And during one show, we put in a making space, a maker space, and it was so successful, we decided to leave it there. And so that has been way more successful. Sometimes it's self-directed activities. Sometimes it's things you can do on your own. You can display your work on the wall, pin it to a magnet board, or magnetize it to a board and display it, leave it behind, take one with you. So it's really a fun way to especially appeal to those that are much more doers. Some people want to go through museums and just look, and others want something else to do while they're there. So we learned that kind of the hard way. It took us a few years to figure it out.
And where the Clyfford Still Museum is located, it's a pretty phenomenal area because you have a lot of things to see. I mean, literally you could spend easily 3 days right in that area, because you have the Denver Art Museum, and directly behind it, if people don't know this, if you've never been to the Clyfford Still Museum, it's right behind the Denver Art Museum there. And then down the street, you have the Vance Kirkland Museum. Three phenomenal museums to be immersed in art, and all offering different things.
It's an interesting condition because on the East Coast, you could drive every 45 miles. There's another great art museum. Where interestingly, once you get to, Kansas City and maybe, in the West, Phoenix, and then you're to California, there's not a lot of world-class institutions in this region. And so when I moved to Denver, it became really apparent that the Denver Civic Center area is the the museums for the Rocky Mountain West, actually. That's where people come in from all the neighboring states, in addition to people who just come through from the rest of the country. But it really is a regional center as much as, for Denver or even Colorado. It's much different out here than it would be in, Boston, New York, Washington, and every, train stop in between, where there's so many great museums of different types. A lot of them are, clustered here in Denver, thankfully for us.
And just recently, it was announced that some things are changing at the museum. You yourself are going to be stepping away, but still be involved in some way, shape, or form. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I made the decision to join the faculty at the University of Denver to head up their museum studies program. I'll also teach art history. And that was something that just really appealed to me, having worked with Clyfford Still for 15 years and, kind of feeling a little bit like I'm an old timer. It's important, I think, to let other people come in and implant their vision. So the museum is just starting a search for my replacement. I'll stay on through September, mid-September. And I'm really looking forward to this next chapter, but I'll live in Denver, which is, I think, a requirement. I wouldn't want to move out of the city, and we'll be able to still visit the museum and everything else. And, probably have an opinion or two about what they're doing along the way, whether they want it or not. If they ask for things, I'm happy to do it. But, usually you need to let a new leader sort of settle in and hopefully change a few things too.
Yeah.
Right. Have a vision of their own.
And it's, I think, incumbent on someone like me to actually acknowledge that I've done it long enough, and it's important to have someone else do it now. So,
yeah.
But it won't change. I can't imagine it will change much of what people have come to look for at the museum. But, there are a number of things, and particularly this new building project, that, I'm excited to see what happens there, as we all will be.
It sounds exciting for your next chapter to go on, and you have all this phenomenal experience and unique experience that, you'll be able to bring to the program there and to the students that'll be taking your classes. So I can only imagine.
Really fascinating. Even, in the last 6 weeks with Black Lives Matter, and even before that with COVID, I mean, just the last 3.5 months have shaped museums in so many ways, and let alone the other things I've seen. My first museum job for pay was in 1987, and a lot has changed in our world since, in museums, let alone the world since then. So that is one of the reasons I got so interested in it, is to, from a historical perspective and from a person who's done it, to sort of prepare, if anyone can do that, prepare, students and others for entering the really complicated state of museums right now.
As we wind this down, is there anything over the years that I know you continue to learn new things about Clyfford Still? Is there a story that you could tell us about him, or something interesting fact that most people don't know?
Yeah, I think the film really did a good service to this. The fact that there's the mythic Still and there's the real Still. And so the more we've dug into the archives, the more that we've talked to the children and other people who knew. There's an artist in New York who grew up in this rural area of Maryland, where Still was now a very senior artist, and she was just getting started as an artist, and to talk to her about what Still was like very late in his career. But there is a much more balanced perspective of this artist than when I started with the project. There was a very narrow view of this curmudgeonly, cranky, unlikable, unpleasant, mysterious artist, who was a control freak. That was sort of how I learned about Clyfford Still. And now, 15 years later, we have a much more rich and more balanced and more interesting artist, than what I grew up with and what I knew about Clyfford Still.
Well, Dean, I appreciate all your time. If you are interested in checking out the museum, you can go to their website. It's clyffordstillmuseum.org, and we'll make sure that we have all that stuff on the episode notes. And I also know that you're all on social media as well, so we'll make sure that people can find that and follow you via social media. I really appreciate your time this evening.
This was fun. Thank you for your interest. We love telling the story, and it helps us a lot. So thank you. I do appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And once again, I've learned a ton these past few months or whatever that we've been doing this, but to learn about Clyfford Still and what he's done for abstract expressionism is, and kind of setting this story straight. Yeah, it's just really, really been a lot of fun. And thank you so much for meeting with us and taking this journey. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks to you both too. Have a good night.
To all of our listeners, wherever you may be, thank you so much for listening. And remember, especially in these difficult times, please support your local museums, galleries, and artists. For Tenet, I'm Todd Pearson.
And I'm Wes Brown.
Have a great week.